This is Why Small Business Matters from Northumbria University, supporting small businesses with the Help to Grow management programme.
Hello and welcome back to Why Small Business Matters. My name is Matt Sutherland, and in today's episode, we discuss the world of technology transfer and explore how ideas with the right support can provide solutions to some of today's most common commercial and social challenges.
Intellectual property, ultimately, if you don't have the right piece of intellectual property managed in the right way, can have its value significantly diminished.
Technology transfer and making innovative technologies sort of come to life is supposed to be difficult.
They were the voices of Ian Thomas and Andy Walsh, two people who know just how powerful the process of technology transfer can be in growing commercial entities and fulfilling customer needs. Ian is head of life sciences at Cambridge Enterprise, part of the University of Cambridge that supports new models for developing early stage technology that can provide effective knowledge exchange. Ian is also the chair of world-leading professional association for knowledge exchange practitioners, Praxis Auril. I'm also joined by Andy Walsh, director and academic liaison at GSK, where he has a focus on supporting GSK scientists to collaborate and innovate with academia. And he also supports the broader knowledge exchange community as an NED at Praxis Auril. Welcome to the podcast. Great to see you both, and thank you so much for joining me on this podcast today. Now, I'm looking forward to today because there's been a real appetite amongst our listeners and the broader knowledge exchange community to get some transparency around this term technology transfer. What do we mean by technology transfer?
Blimey, what a great question, Matt. So look, technology transfer means many different things to many different people, but in our context, where we're really working with the transfer of the wonderful outputs of the eclectic research that people do across the entire research base. We're trying to transfer the benefits of that into some form of utility in many, many other places. Now, people always consider that as moving things in a sort of very technical sense from a university to a business, but it may be to a broader set of people than that. It may be to providing advice to government, it may be providing support to NGOs or whatever. But really, the act of the transfer is making sure that we can capitalize on the technology, which in itself is sort of the practical uses of knowledge and insight that we've got, transfer of that to some form of utility. And the transfer process isn't just a blind activity. You can't throw it over the fence and hope for the best. It's a very active process because we produce stuff that is not necessarily fully useful. And the people who wish to receive or benefit from it maybe aren't well placed to fully consume it in that form. And we have to bridge that gap so both parties can benefit and enjoy the fruits of their labour or the fruits of the opportunity. Along that way, it also has to be contractualised. So what do I mean by that? All this is done where there are legal obligations. There need to be clear obligations, clear undertakings, so one knows what is going on, because it's not just about transfer of rights, it's a transfer of further commitment beyond that particular moment, and people need to understand what they're getting themselves into. And technology transfer is the whole schema there.
I think what I can take from that is that there are number of steps in this process. It's probably far from linear, but it does seem quite binary. You have the technology probably
linear?
at the foundation. In theory, there's the technology which is underpinning it, and then you talk, Ian, about the transfer and maybe the commercialization of that. And what is this kind of so-called benefit, this utility? Andy, I wonder if I could bring you in. What do we mean when we talk about technology? Is this just scientific, or is this broader?
So I think it depends a lot on who you're talking to at the time, and I think from a large pharmaceutical company perspective, it really does mean a full gamut of novel innovations across multiple sectors. So it really is anything that can actually enhance your technical capabilities as a business would be the broader sort of definition that we use. So, and there's many ways in which you can do that. You can gain better, information around design of a manufacturing process. You could be given you could be bringing in a candidate therapeutic. You may have a new analytical technique. That all of those would be examples of technologies that allow us to, as a company, to develop medicines better than and sell medicines better than we can at the moment.
So technology is very much something to be excited about. And I suppose one of the first kind of $1 million questions is, when you do have nascent technology which you perceive as being exciting, it looks like it hasn't been done before, there's a value. How do you check? How do you know that it isn't out there already?
So I think from, again, GSK R&D is an unusual sort of company in many ways, in that we are very much, we're a very large research organisation, staffed with people whose job it is to be current with their particular field. So we have, the rank and file of our organisation are reasonably well placed to actually identify the gaps in what they are, what they've got available now, and what is coming over the horizon. So to a certain extent, we listen to our people. They're the network that is out there looking for sector specific knowledge, and know where those gaps relate to their current and future strategies. So we've got that area of it, that we know that things like AI and ML have great opportunities. We know that we may well have connections already with academic leaders in a particular field, that we would go, we would be reading their papers and actually going, actually they've made a significant advance and we should follow up with them and find out or collaborate with them. And so we are very much part of that network of innovation, and we're hungry for it, because we need, actually developing medicines is hard at the best of times, and there's a lot of other people trying to do it better than we can. So we really are hungry for any opportunity that will allow us to actually, do our role in society better.
And it's interesting that you talk about that kind of network and the power of the network, and even maybe some local knowledge, knowing what is going to be the hot topic, what's in vogue, what would you be looking out for? Now, I know within your role, Andy, you're director and academic liaison at GSK, so you have a relationship with universities in this space. What's that like, working with, sitting at a large multinational as your employer, but having professional relationships with universities in this technology arena?
I think it's it sort of parallels a lot of the roles that my colleagues in KE in academia have as well, in that we are all of us that are operating in this space. I like to say we're actually quite two-faced. And what I mean by that is that we're actually facing in two directions at the same time. And what that means is that you have to have the relationship with people outside the organization. But also you need to have the relationship with people within your organization, and actually trying to improve the performance and the ability of people within your organization to engage with the outside world is a key part of the role. The other thing that the way in which we work is actually quite a devolved method, in that actually whenever we're involved in any sort of engagement with the academic world, we do try and make sure that we've got a single point of accountability from a project perspective. So we've identified someone from within the organization who is responsible for that relationship. So whether it's a research collaboration, or maybe if it's in licensing of a piece of technology, we actually have someone who is identified as being responsible for all of the technical aspects. And in that sense, my job then becomes to support them. So yes, I have my own relationships, but actually I am also supporting our business owners in their relationships with the academic world.
That's really interesting. So the communication then between those multiple parties is absolutely key, isn't it? To actually, well, not even just manage, but to be able to deliver.
Yeah, I think that what I was going to say is that I think the more, as you progress through this, this sort of profession, is that you ever increasing in your emphasis on the nature of relationships. The success or failure of pretty much everything that we do as we work across the interface of industry and academia does come down to relationships and actually trying to understand the drivers on both sides. And I think it is very, very hard, particularly for a lot of my work is actually, we access a lot of technology through research collaborations. And if you haven't got a good collaborative relationship between the GSK lead and the academic lead, it's impossible for it to be, for an effective collaboration to be sort of wrought into shape by people outside, whether that's sort of people like Ian and myself sort of wading in, or senior leadership. It is absolutely key that we get that relationship absolutely right. And I think that's a really important skill set that we both need, both sides of this interface need to develop.
Yeah, right. I think a lot of it's on trust, isn't it? And there is that kind of famous sort of phrasing of, it's the hardest thing to get, but the easiest thing to lose. And it sounds like it's really based on those like long-term relationships. We had Ollie Barrett on the podcast, who is one of the most connected people in Europe, a super connector. And he talks about the only way of winning new work is actually to be outside of your organisation and to be with new parties and entering the discussions. And it sounds like you need to be in those fields anyway to get the technology, but it's also an important part is the underpinning relationships in those areas, which are key. Ian, if I can bring you in, you've of course been listening to this, and we kind of have a scenario here where we've got new nascent technology which is excited, and the kind of large pharma machines such as GSK are excited about them too, but there has to be a point where a decision has to be made to protect that new knowledge. And I think what we're talking about here is IP, intellectual property. So within the technology transfer process, how important is getting the IP in place?
I can answer that in one word: vital. I think it's probably more useful to say why, how, and when. Ultimately, the outputs of the research endeavors that give rise to technology that large companies, small companies, startups, investors may be interested in is pretty intangible. It's intellectual property that's critical to that. And that's ultimately what's traded at the transactional level, and that's the bit that allows resources to move around. But obviously, then it's as Andy has highlighted, it's brought to life through the relationships and the doing by people. But intellectual property, ultimately, if you don't have the right piece of intellectual property managed in the right way, can have its value significantly diminished. And so our role in this process is to understand how best to do that in a way that positions ourselves such that intellectual property, as it's further developed, as we get more data or build bigger relationships that mean we get to the point of a transaction, has sufficient value that people actually want to invest in it. And an investor may be a straight cash investor, a venture capitalist into a spin out, may be a licensee. They're investing their internal resources into it. They'll only do that if they believe that, subject to all the technical risk and all the other market risk, that the intellectual property won't be a failing part of that chain of critical assets. So yes, we've got to get that absolutely right. But it's sometimes, I think, what we should remember, we're working at the cutting edge of technology frequently, not always, but sometimes we're dealing with stuff that often is pre-ready for the market. The market is maybe not understanding that this whatever it is could be done. So our job is to take a bit of a punt, frankly, and which is driven by an imagination and a vision of the future of what might be, and we have to sort of protect it sort of with that view of the possible, not necessarily the certain. And that is our role, to take those risks, because that's what really changes businesses, really changes society from time to time. So critically important to get right.
And it's interesting from an outside perspective that you can imagine that when you do get that really cutting edge technology, there could be an urge to start to get the IP in place. But actually, I just wonder, listening to Andy, that actually maybe, and I could be wrong, it's something that you do a little bit later on, because actually it's the relationships and that trust and that bit of sharing that might get you to the point where you got the confidence in that technology to go with it and to then put the IP in place. Am I wrong in saying that? Or
no, and I think you're right, but it's very much driven by when is the best time to make that protection, and there are competing things here, because if you protect early, you've certainly put your marker in the temporal sand for the world. That's great. But technology takes a heck of a long time to develop, and your IP protection is basically 20 years. And so the later you leave it, the more protection you might have during its valuable years. And so you just have to make that gamble about what are other people doing the same things. Are we going to take a bit of a risk and go later? It's also to remember that if you file early, you may actually have devalued the technology in itself for two reasons. One is, after 18 months, you've told the world, but that the IP will be published. The world will see what you had, and you may not have actually developed it that far. So at which point you might be in this conundrum where you can't really get as good a value deal out of it. And if you can't get a good a value deal out of it, you may not get a deal at all. If you haven't got a deal at all, you've achieved nothing. So that judgment of when to protect your IP is important. And people always play, and I don't think it's like this, but they say, do you want a patent or do I want to publish this? And that's the academic mindset. I actually don't think that's real. I think it's a very easy thing to say. I think it's frankly trite. I think often you could have a very sophisticated conversation and quite a careful relationship, and again, come back to relationship based discussion about working out when strategically we need to protect the IP, but also look after the research career of the creators of the IP. So it's a balancing act. Often you can get it wrong. I'm sure you never get it perfect, but you can think in a very much more sophisticated way than just, can I put my stake in the ground today?
That's really interesting. There's a bit of gaming going on. And I imagine just to paint the picture, how many people are in that, are party to that decision? How many people, I'm thinking from the academic side and the legal team, and how many people are involved where you've got to get everyone together, where you sort of, I suppose, push the button and you do register, for example, the patent? How many people are involved in that? Is it 2 or 3, or is it more than 10? I think that clarity would be really helpful.
Yeah, it does depend a little bit on the organisation. Some organisations have some quite devolved decision making, and there's panels you have to go through, and there's sort of committees to get sign-offs, and that can be quite a lot of people where they've got this formalised stage gate process. I think in Cambridge we have a much more devolved point of interaction kind of activity. So what does that mean? Clearly the creators of the intellectual property are part of that decision-making process. But then, at least in our teams, there's 1 or 2 people who work on that with the researchers. They may bring in a couple of colleagues or get a bit of expert advice if they need it, but it's a very much more tight-knit team that makes that. And I think that's about, A, there's the understanding, and B, it's about commitment and championing. So can they see the researchers are going to commit to what's going to be a long journey? Can the knowledge exchange professionals who are doing this, are they going to commit to it and champion it? Because lots of stuff is driven beyond reason, because it's a gamble, and you need people to have that nerve to say, I'm going to work on this because I believe it's going to be worth a go. So we have a quite tight-knit, so our decision is essentially 2 people plus the researchers, unless there's some extreme situation. Other places have a stage gate process which can involve 7, 8, 9, 10 people.
And actually, I'm thinking, at the very start, you talked about technology transfer being quite binary. It was my language anyway. Having the technology, having that IP, as we've recently discussed, to have everything tight and in place. And then you talked about the transfer. And one thing that's coming to mind when listening to you both is when you're thinking about that kind of second piece, which is the transfer out to potential industry and to the end customer, potential end game. Are you working with people then who you already know, or are you going out to the market to complete that second phase and dealing with people who you've not dealt with before. It sounds like, and it sounds like you could be working with people who you already know, based on the emphasis on relationships.
It's both, I think, is the reality, because clearly, when you have a technology, it is only of value to a very small subset of the, let's say it's an industrial community. And then there's timing there as well. Now, of course, it massively helps if you're working with people who you know, who trust that when you talk to them about a new opportunity, believe it's likely to be of interest or value, and you've got that credibility. If you've curated it, or they believe that you're not going to present something that at least isn't worth looking at. But if you're only stuck with the people you know, then you're really restricting your market opportunities, and that's not really fair for extracting the best value for the technology for the people who are potential direct or indirect beneficiaries, be that the creators or their employer, the university, or in fact the funders or the UK economy or the charity that funded it. So we have an obligation to make the best of that in a market where we do have good relationships, but we do not have all the relationships. So we certainly going out there, either actively building new relationships in a context of a deal we may want to do, or more likely it's about you're building preemptive relationships so you know more people for the next time you have a new technology. You have a broader network of people you can talk to. So no, we don't always do deals with the same people, but it does help to know people hugely.
You're listening to Why Small Business Matters. Find out how Northumbria University can help your business thrive through the Help to Grow management program, delivered by leading small business and enterprise experts from Northumbria University, with the support of leading figures from industry and experienced entrepreneurs. The program supports senior managers of small and medium-sized businesses to boost their business's performance, resilience, and long-term growth. The 12-week program is 90% funded by the government, and the fee payable by participants is £750, and has been designed to allow participants to complete it alongside full-time work. The in-depth, high-quality curriculum supports you to build your capabilities in leadership, innovation, digital adoption, employee engagement, marketing, responsible business, and financial management. By the end of the program, you'll develop a business growth plan to help you lead your business to realize its potential. To find out more about the program, the modules, eligibility, and fees and delivery dates, go to northumbria.ac.uk/help-to-grow.
You're listening to Why Small Business Matters. My name's Matt Sutherland. Today we're joined by Ian Thomas, Head of Life Sciences at Cambridge Enterprise, and Andy Walsh, Director and Academic Liaison at GSK. Andy, Ian's talked about at Cambridge Enterprise having a finite number of people who can quite cleanly get the IP in place. When we're talking about transfer, and we're talking about now taking it to industry, potential end customers, what parties, what skills are needed to do that kind of second phase of technology transfer?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the technology and how it is being brought in. We will quite often access university technology essentially through the commercialization vehicles that the universities have set up. So certainly I've had more conversations about technology coming from spin-out companies or potential spin-out companies from Cambridge since I've moved it to GSK than I have for straightforward accessing of technology through a licensing deal from the university. So to a certain extent, it's a case of one of the real jobs that Ian and his team have is to actually try and understand, well, what is the appropriate place to put the technology in order for it to impact on a larger company like GSK. And there'll be a whole suite of stuff that actually GSK may be the end user of, but will not be the primary recipient of the IP. So that's where the spin-out companies who are basically going to do an awful lot of that work, which is taking stuff from early stage academic research, making it into a product, and then we buy it. And so from a GSK perspective, the people that are involved at that are those that, it's the scientists at the bench who are able to go, there's a new product on the market, it would be helpful to our business. We're going to buy some samples, we'll run some evaluations, and we'll just bring it in. And that may be backed by conversations that have been had with the academic founders or the tech transfer people years previously. If we're actually bringing technology in from on a IP licensing transaction, there'll be a different suite of people there, and it will involve a scientific lead. It will involve people whose job it is to assess technologies and make sure that they are, that they're able to do what they propose. There'll be lawyers, and we'll do the transaction. There may well be alliance managers who have spent their time making sure that all the downstream stuff happens and supporting the relationship. So there will be a hierarchy of people who make the decision as to whether or not we're actually going to do the transaction. So there's a substantial football team sort of behind the scenes of the people that are actually making that direct contact.
And I think what this really does is recognize that you're trying to bridge a gap between two very willing parties who haven't got quite the right impedance set up. And that's for very sensible, very understandable reasons, because research does what it does and generates new insight about the world, and then applicability may be imaginable. And people maybe do some for development work at that, but it's still a very long way off. Almost always, you should never say never, but almost always a hugely long way off from being ready for the market. But it's often usually a long way off from being ready for a company like GSK or any other industrial company to ingest and use immediately. And so this is where that gap it will always exist. It's actually, and it's our job just to bridge it in as efficient way as possible, but recognizing what we do, whilst critical to the process, is driven by slightly different drivers in terms of what our researchers want, and what our industrial colleagues want is slightly more advanced. So our job is bridge the TRL gap, which is the technology readiness level gap. And that's where startup companies come into it. It's where translational funding comes into it. It remains where collaborations, where we both have mutual sort of guidance on how things move forward, are all extremely valuable. But they then all talk to time commitment, trust, relationships. Oh, and I think we mentioned earlier, getting the IP filed right at the right time, such that we can all enjoy the benefits of that and recognize the commitments and resources that each other have put into it or will have to put into it.
And you both mentioned startups and spin-outs, and I know a lot of small businesses that listen to this podcast are already trading, or they might partner with the university to do a knowledge transfer partnership. So they're already trading and they work with the university to make a step change in their core business. And I think where their ears will be pricked is that you're talking about a process of taking nascent technology in some shape or form, very thoughtful thinking about how the IP is recorded, and then you're commercializing that. And then they hear spin-outs. So actually, universities in a way, and maybe it's clunky language, but are potentially SME factories for bringing new firms to market to mobilize this technology.
There's no doubt about that. They absolutely are creators of S. They don't create the middle. The middles grow from the S, but we're the creator of small companies. There's no doubt about that. And then the trajectory of those small companies in terms of the technology transfer process is variable, and sometimes they'll try and grow themselves to the point where they're trading themselves in extremis, and sometimes they'll see them at the other end as being solely a development vehicle where they're trying to move that technology package to a point where it's developed sufficiently that the likes of, obviously we've got GSK on the call here, on the podcast, would want to buy them as a later stage in the development process. So yes, so they will no longer remain on the market. But yes, we do generate lots and lots of small companies as a community.
Yeah, and I think from a GSK perspective, we are interested in novel, innovative tools to support, say, drug discovery. But what we're not interested in is being a manufacturer and development of those tools and assays. So we want to buy, what we be able to do is to access that technology, but actually we want somebody else to actually provide that to us as a product. So we can be quite often, we might be part of a discussion around what would a good product look like and how would it meet our needs. But that doesn't mean we'd be a licensee. And the startup are absolutely a vital point in taking that technology out of the university's hands, industrializing it, being able to scale manufacture, make sure that it's actually in a fit state where we can just buy stuff off the shelf and use it. And I think that's I think it sounds really obvious now, but I think particularly in the earlier days of tech transfer, I think there was certainly an expectation that any technology that GSK scientists had said that they were interested in meant that the scientific leads or the inventors thought, great, that GSK will be a licensee for this, and it's like, no, please go off to, please come up and give us something. What we want is a box with this stuff in it that we can use, and once you've got that, we'll buy loads, but we're not going to bring it in house. And that's a trend that has increased as we have increasingly outsourced a lot of what would have been key functions. So anything that's sort of peripheral to that, we would rather actually remained outside and we access it.
That's interesting. Yeah. So actually the picture that you both paint really of technology transfer is one that fosters innovation and improves the nation's competitiveness. How does government support this activity? Is it something that it's keen to champion? Is there tax incentives? Is there interventions to support this work?
Government is hugely supportive of this. I mean, it's part of the government's agenda to become a science superpower and understand the sort of technology and then therefore economic benefits from that. And government's really good at supporting that. I mean, people always will commonly complain about bits they don't like, but actually, if you look at it as a package, it's pretty good. So we fund science at a very fundamental level, and we recognise that blue sky research is critical and exciting things come out of it. We fund directed science from particular calls through the NHS on NIHR, for example, and then we have funding which comes through Innovate UK, which is actually for funding SMEs in their part of this. And there are varying degrees of tax incentives along the way that smaller organizations get better tax incentives than bigger organizations, and there are very good reasons for that. But overall it's quite a package of things, and it's getting better with time. What we had 10 years ago and 20 years ago was not what we had now, and I'm sure it'll get better as time moves on. So I'm broadly positive. Of course, it can improve. Of course, we'd like more. Of course, we'd like greater commitments. But that's part of the process of generating a new ecosystem and working out where the balance should eventually sit.
Andy, you've talked about having really good, solid infrastructures for being able to identify the technologies that will be the type that GSK want to bring in and run with. There's a huge lot of discussion around AI and machine learning and new techniques that are coming to the market. What's on the horizon then for technology transfer? What are people looking out for, or even what are people a little bit wary?
I mean, so we've made a very public commitment to the AI and ML space. We've made a lot of announcements. It's backed by some really big spends, and it was also a key element in our effort, in terms of collaborating with universities. I think where it has actually impacted on is in terms of, well, what are we actually interested in outside? It's data becomes a very different beast when you're able to apply these sorts of analytical techniques to it. So it's really increased the speed at which we are focused on accessing these huge scale data sets, and the UK, I think, is very well placed for that. We've had a long-standing commitment to the UK Biobank. We're part of a project to sequence the full genome of every single participant in there, which is a mind-boggling sort of 500,000 people, and what that's doing for us actually is a really profound shift in the way in which we investigate human biology and build medicines on the basis of that. And we're really starting to work far more in the human system right from the get-go. There's an old model of what pharmaceutical companies used to look like, and that there was like a bunch of chemists. Then there was some, some pharmacologists with sort of various sort of animal models where they would test stuff out, and then we'd run some clinical trials. And actually now we're going right into the biology. We're trying to understand things at a genetic level. So that's where, so that means that we've had interest in AI and ML as building our capacity to do that. So recruiting people, setting up engagements and collaborations with key people in that space. Plus then that whole access to data sets, committing to the generation and the analysis of those data sets. And I think it's starting to shift the way in which we do things downstream of that. So I think that's been one of the biggest changes that I've seen sort of in the last few years.
So, Ian, we know that you're head of life sciences at Cambridge Enterprise, which is part of the University of Cambridge. And we also appreciate that a lot of the work that you will be involved in is confidential. But are there any examples that you can share with the listeners on today's podcast?
Oh, yes, definitely. So we had the extraordinary privilege to work on a company and technology sort of based on the backwaters of the immune system, as was perceived at the time, called complement. And that already sounds quite esoteric. But so what value does that have? But it transpired we had a hugely inspired academic colleague who understood that this may have implications for the treatment of age-related macular degeneration. And to cut a very long story short, very good colleague in the team who happens to be Andy on this podcast, but who's moved on to GSK, worked with that academic in a very profoundly deep way to build an opportunity that then we started working with some venture capitalists to then spin out an opportunity to develop medicines that could potentially treat age-related macular degeneration, a serious eye condition that large numbers of older people suffer from, and for which basically there's no good treatment. And to cut a long story short, that company went extremely well, raised lots of money, and we're very grateful to our investors, which is Syncona, fantastic investors. But that company, which we founded, was called Gyroscope Therapeutics, and it got sold to Novartis in November 2021 for $1.8 billion US, half of which was paid in cash. The rest will be paid on basis of success. But that whole story took about 8 years. I forget exactly, but the work that all those parties did, the researcher, 40 years of research, Andy in the team here, coupled with investors like Chris Hollywood, thank you very much, Chris, and then a team of people beyond the skill sets Andy had or I had, or took that to a further point, sold it to a massive pharmaceutical company. Whether it's successful or not, that's still in trials. But if it is, that will benefit a huge number of people. We're delighted about that. It's a wonderful story and tells you time commitment, had to get the intellectual property right. We've talked about that, and it's still a big gamble. So yes, still the jury's out, but it was worth doing.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a great story. Actually, it was even the history of it goes even further back, because some of the fundamental work that the academic had done was sort of done in like 1975, and there was a degree of like a eureka moment that he had, many years later, where he actually could realise that this was could be applicable to age-related macular degeneration. I think it also speaks to the challenges, though, because this was not, the gyroscope solution was not the archetypal sort of spin out where you have a great academic, they become the founder of a new company, and then it sort of expands from there. It was really built from, a little bit, there was the stuff from Cambridge, there were academics from other parts of the country. The investors really played a very proactive role at sort of building a company out of a number of sort of constituent bricks. And I think, to me, it is a great success story, but it does speak to the challenge that we have. And I think anybody who tries to tell you that tech transfer would be easy if only X or Y happened really doesn't understand the process, because what we're trying to do here is really come up with world-changing technologies, and it is hard. It's kind of meant to be hard. So I think one of my big lessons from that is like, yeah, that was a success, but actually the challenge was met with people who were not afraid to overcome the complexity of the situation.
And I think just to add that, I think it highlights the value of doing fundamental research. You do not know what you will find, but it's also, if you're going to do this job really well, and you do understand how you're going to benefit as many people as possible, or stakeholders and patient beneficiaries or market beneficiaries or whatever, you have got to empower people to be imaginative and to take intelligent risks, and to do it as part of a team where they go out and seek that expertise wherever necessary, because that is all about giving yourself the best possible chance of success in a world where most things fail. But all those failures do not mean you're doing a bad job.
The huge amount of experience and successes that you've had in the technology transfer field, what tip would you give to somebody new to this area?
So I think my top tip is to remember it's very, very difficult, but stick by your guns when you start to have an imaginative idea, and because if you don't, you won't be able to deliver on the difficult. That does not mean dogmatic. Always adapt your position and your route forward as you get new information. But if you aren't willing to take that challenge and champion things, you won't do the biggest, most exciting things. So have the courage to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, effectively, my top tip would be a variation of the same. It's embrace the difficulty and the challenge and the complexity, because, as I say, I believe that technology transfer and making innovative technologies sort of come to life is supposed to be difficult, but actually it is one of the most exciting things that I think you can do as a job. So it is something that is worth doing, and I think always seeking to work in an environment where that is appreciated. And I think the tech transfer environment has changed a lot over the years that I've been involved at whatever level, and I think that's slowly starting to come true. Tech transfer offices are not supposed to self-funding on the revenues of their deals within sort of 4 to 5 years, or that actually the patent protection is only available for the first sort of 30 months of a technology's life. That people are prepared to play the longer game.
What are the challenges for SMEs who are hungry to access new technologies that are already
So I think
trading?
One of the big challenges, and hopefully you've picked it up through some of the answers, discussion in this podcast, is that you need a massive number of skill sets to engage in this type of activity from both sides of the transfer process. So, and not all SMEs have access to all of those skill sets on their books, because it is a resource commitment. It's committing people who you're paying salaries to, and it's also then the risk appetite is, you've got to have the right risk appetite. And also small organizations may be doing only one, or if at most a very, very few interactions. They've not really got the opportunity to manage their risk of working on new technologies over a portfolio. So that does make it much harder to work with those companies, and for those companies to do it, despite the fact that lots of the outputs from our wonderful research base in this country could be directly valuable to them after a bit of commitment and integration. Very, very difficult.
Can you tell us about Praxis Auril and what it does?
Praxis Auril is an organisation for professionals who are in the KE sector, and that's a broad group of people. And it is there to provide them with access to training, as well as access to networks that will allow them to be more effective in their roles. And it's a really important organisation from as far as GSK is concerned, because not only do our own people access the training support that comes from that organisation, but we feel that it's really important that there is an organisation of that nature supporting the sector across the whole, and particularly for the people who we are working with in universities and other academic institutions.
Thank you to my guests Ian Thomas and Andy Walsh. And don't forget to check out previous episodes of the podcast. exploring award-winning edtech and knowledge exchange with Kevry, and solving problems of the future with Joe Marshall and Stuart Wilkinson. And if you would like to find out more information about the Help to Grow Management Programme, go to northumbria.ac.uk/Help to Grow. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Why Small Business Matters.